feel like the word sustainability is kind of a buzzword now. We're used to hearing it. So for me, like when we use the word, we need to define it for ourselves in a way that puts action behind it. So for me, sustainability is giving our communities the tools they need to survive without the bureaucratic and frankly violent systems that we've essentially been conditioned to believe that we need to survive. Part of this is being energy efficient. It's dealing with the effects of climate change. It's having food sovereignty. And part of it is breaking cycles of abuse and violence that we have become very complicit in because it's normalized and we haven't been given the tools to start combating it ourselves. So, one mechanism of kind of contending with these issues of harm and abuse is transformative justice. I'm gonna like to start by kind of defining the language of transformative justice, just because I want to make sure I'm not throwing around words that are leaving people kind of in the dust. So I use the word carceral a lot, and when I say carceral, I'm referring to our carceral culture, our carceral society. If you've read Foucault, you probably are familiar. I define it slightly differently. I don't mean to directly reference like bars, cages, incarceration. I'm talking about how violent systems are replicated in our schools, in our organizing spaces, everywhere in our society. And I will kind of illustrate that a little bit more later, and it'll probably make a little more sense, hopefully. And then the second term that I use is harm culture, which just means that we normalize hurtful behaviors, gendered and racial microaggressions. Those are all forms of harm that a lot of people kind of just overlook, and they contribute to violence just as much as visible violence. So survivor-centered transformative justice is built on healing and accountability, based on the wishes and needs of individual survivors. I firmly believe that the first step in preventing and reducing harm is addressing it, and that's something we don't do a lot in our spaces. Those conversations are difficult. But we have to look at how harm is being perpetuated in our spaces. And in order to be able to spot it, we have to understand it a little bit more. We have to be able to check ourselves, and understand how, harm doesn't always have to be being physically violent or sexually violent. It can be a lot more subtle and just as potent. And so when you start understanding harm outside of the behaviors that the system has criminalized, you start seeing it around you, maybe even in yourself. You see it when, men talk over others, and you see it when people are disrespectful of pronouns. And an example I like to use is when you just I feel like this happens to femme presenting people the most, is when you put your hand on someone's back in order to walk past them. Did you ask for consent about that? Harm is so prevalent. We don't notice we're doing those things. So when given this space to identify and discuss and process harm, people really start to realize how much harm is being perpetuated. So that's kind of the first step. In order to repair harm, we have to look at the needs of the survivor or the person who's been harmed. And once we have listened and learned from the survivor, then we can pursue accountability. And in transformative justice, this can look like a lot of things. In some cases, it looks like transformative healing for both parties. That might be counseling, that might be facilitating conversations. And other times it's going to look like more concrete measures to make sure the survivor and the community are safe from a potentially harmful person. And when going through transformative justice processes, we have to understand why harm is happening. Part of repairing harm is understanding where it came from and transforming the individual who did that harm so as to prevent from causing harm harmed. This is, of course, this is one of these things that people kind of get caught up on. They're like, but this is not to make excuses for perpetrators. They still committed a harm and to be held accountable. But we can much better hold people kind of why that harm happened, where it came from. And ultimately, when we work on these individual transformations, we actually transform the system as a whole, because the system relies on cycles of violence and trauma. This is another thing that people tend to get caught up on, because I've heard that people kind of think that when I say that, I'm contradicting myself, because I'm both talking about systemic cycles of violence and individual. These cycles of violence do rely on individuals being complicit and learning the violence. And so we do, we can't expect the system to change in a day. And so it does start in our communities, create one person at a time. I like to use the example of the public school disciplinary system to talk about transformative justice, because I think it's a really good way to demonstrate carceralism outside of the prison system. When a student does something like wrong, they're punished, given detention or knocked a few points, and they're rarely asked why they committed the harm. They're rarely given a chance or asked to understand the harm they committed. The system only seeks to make the wrong behavior disappear instead of getting to the root of why it happened and taking the steps to repair it. So instead of giving the opportunity for the student to understand the harm and repair it, they're actually reinforcing the harm, because that student is ultimately being harmed, and chances are this kind of carceral punishment system is actually harming the survivor as well, because in these cases, survivors are rarely asked what they want or need from the person who harmed them. Like, is the person being given detention really what they need in order to feel safe in their community? I don't know. You're going to have to ask them. I can't answer that for you. Healing isn't linear, and so we can't expect the same system to work for everyone. So yeah, when agents of the system, like principals or guidance counselors, choose to punish a perpetrator or force an apology on a survivor, they're controlling the narrative for the survivor, which is further stripping survivors of their power. Using a transformative justice framework, the process will look very different. First we would listen to the experience of the student who was harmed and give them options for resources or pursuing accountability from the person who harmed them. That could be, a facilitated conversation with the perpetrator. That could be moving the perpetrator out of their class so they don't have to interact with them. And then we can pursue options that make them feel comfortable. Every process is different, but there's probably going to be a conversation with the person who was, accused of the harm, and depending on how the survivor feels and how the accused students, how willing they are to take responsibility and learn, then we can decide how the harm can be repaired and not repeated in the future. Completely different, I promise. It's better. That's just like, it's better. It's going to work out better for everyone. In most cases, of course, like, it's not universal, but that's kind of the whole thing with transformative justice, is it's not supposed to be universal. It's not a uniform system. This is a part where I feel like also people tend to get confused. We have to remember that visible violence, the violence we see and criminalize, is a product of violence that, cuts deeper, violence of oppressive systems that ultimately creates cycles of abuse. The system labels crimes, and those aren't the only types of harm that are being perpetrated. And so until we address harm holistically, without causing more harm, the cycles are going to keep repeating, which logically makes sense, but is still very hard to kind of comprehend when we've been living in a system that doesn't think like that at all. So yeah, in addressing harm, based on the needs of individual survivors and individual cases of harm, and working for accountability and transformation and repair instead of punishment, we're actually preventing harm, because you can't repair harm with a system that creates it. And punishment systems are just harming more people in most cases. We live in a system that makes problems disappear. Angela Davis has an amazing quote. I'm going to paraphrase because I never get it exactly right, but it's, prisons don't disappear problems, they disappear people, is essentially what she's saying. They don't deal with the violence, they just put people in a cage so that the violence isn't where anyone can see it anymore. And that's not necessarily addressing the violence, and it's not necessarily protecting people, because it's just kind of continuing this violence. We have to get to the root of where this violence is coming from if we really want to change it. And these accountability conversations are certainly jarring because we aren't necessarily used to having conversations from this perspective. We think about harm in a very binary way. I'll think a lot of violence in our culture is binary. It's that people believe that there's a good or an evil. They believe it's a male or female. The binary goes so far beyond what we kind of think about. And until we address that, existence is complex and it's not black and white, we're going to continue kind of missing the mark. And marginalized communities, indigenous communities, they've been using transformative justice for decades. This isn't a new concept. I didn't invent it. Angela Davis didn't invent it. Communities that have been abused and forgotten by the system have been finding ways to heal their own communities, and it's entirely possible. We have to kill the cops in our heads that are telling us that we need these systems, and then start to make the transition into different systems that don't rely on punishment and carceralism and assumptions. And I know I kind of speed through this stuff. It's a lot to digest at first. We've grown up in this carceral culture. It's a part of us. It's a culture that relies on systems of oppression and punishment and capitalism to function. And these carceral systems, they're replicated everywhere we look. They're in our justice system, they're in our schools, they're in our workplaces. And so, in order to understand transformative justice and kill those cop heads, we have to start rejecting those systems when we see them. And of course, conversations on abolition of transformative justice, it's you're not gonna understand it or have all of the answers in a day. It's all a process. You just gotta start kind of flicking Officer Steve when he starts telling you that carceralism is necessary. So that's kind of the meat of my spiel. It's just us. We have to start because carceral systems aren't serving most of us, and they're harming a lot of us. And in order to repair harm, we have to unlearn it, and then hopefully prevent it. So that's most of what I'm gonna drop on you right now. I totally want to continue this discussion and answer questions, or just if you have comments, drop your comments. I'm also going to drop a link to a transformative justice framework that my friend Autumn and I, along with 12 other organizers from across the country, actually created to deal with harm in our own organizations. It's a framework, so it doesn't have all of the through transformative justice to kind of understand how you might be implementing it in your own life and in your own organizations. I have to do some shameful self-promotion, which is just that, like, it's not even really self-promotion just because it's not about me at all. But like, if you want to start having these conversations and start figuring out how to adopt transformative justice frameworks in your organizations, like, I'm totally happy to like talk. I'm in no way, shape, or form an expert. I'm a student of transformative justice and abolition. This is a framework that I created based on my organizing experience, and it's still growing and changing, as am I. But, you know, the more conversations we have about it and the more organizations that start to use it, the more we'll kind of begin to understand it and hopefully grow it. So yeah, any thoughts? I can let you guys sit with that for a minute. I know it's like kind of like a lot. I feel like when I was like writing the framework, I would kind of sitting there like with my own mind blown, like thinking about all of this. Like it's a lot to take in. And like once you start thinking about it, you don't stop thinking about it because you kind of start to see it everywhere. I'm also gonna just like drop in the chat the link to Transform Harm, which is my favorite transformative justice resource. It was created by an amazing abolitionist, Mariam Kaba. And it just, wow, the link fully just didn't work. I'm gonna try again. And it just is kind of a hub of abolitionist and transformative and restorative justice resources. Yeah. So where are we at? Thoughts? Feelings? Feel free to type in the chat or speak up or don't speak up. I don't want to like put anyone on the spot.
I had a question. I don't know if it can actually be answered, but it's more of a hypothetical. So when you were talking about how like carceral systems and disciplinary systems work differently for every individual, and like not every single person can be disciplined in the same way because of either different reactions that they would have or different circumstances that cause them to be involved in those systems. Is there like a practical way of not having an actual system with like guiding principles of discipline and correctional actions, I guess, in order to correct behaviors? Like, is there a way to not have a system and instead focus on each individual's needs? I just feel like that would be a really difficult thing to do. It would be the ideal, but it would just be really difficult, especially in like federal prisons, which obviously shouldn't exist, but as long as they do exist, like in a system that complex and that big, is there a way to not have an institutional system in place?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, of course, like I just want to like preface this by saying like I don't have all the answers, but I'm gonna kind of just like give you my thoughts on this. So the first thing, like in the language of like how you presented that question, and this is like, I'm not like calling you out or anything, just how you were talking about how we handle like perpetrators of harm. And I want to just like rewind, because in having these conversations, like for me, the goal of transformative justice processes is to focus on the survivor, not actually the perpetrator. And so not figuring out how we have to deal with the perpetrator, thinking of what does the survivor need in order to feel like they've got an accountability for what happened to them, and then figure out the steps that the perpetrator needs to take. In terms of like talking about large scale abolition, we have to remember that abolition is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to suddenly not have federal prisons. I mean, that would be like amazing if we suddenly didn't have a prison system. But in a country that is so reliant on prison systems, they're not going to go away in a day. So for me, like what I'm thinking about is just how do we begin implementing abolitionist strategies in our communities? Because the fact is that's where change is going to come from, is by creating change in our communities and working bottom up. In terms of like a large scale abolitionist society, yeah, that's the goal. That is what we should be working towards, is figuring out how to transition away from, you know, having these systems or needing these systems. And I mean, I think it's fully possible. I think we'll see that, you know, a lot of the people who are currently imprisoned are not imprisoned for things that cannot be, you know, fixed by, you know, changing how our culture functions. If you think about the majority of people who are in federal prisons right now, are in prison for nonviolent offenses. Like in prisons total, nonviolent offenses, a lot of drug offenses, that kind of stuff. And, you know, sorry, train of thought. But like, yes, nonviolent offenses. So like, how can we fix that? Like, what is the solution there? Okay, so we can legalize marijuana. We can give people health care. We can give people access to education. We can give people access to jobs that pay a living wage, so they feel they don't have to resort to things that are considered crimes. Those things alone, creating a society where people aren't expected to struggle, where there is some measure of equity, is already going to change, you know, how we look at the quote unquote need for prisons. And I mean, there have been cases where restorative justice has been used in, like, you know, regular kind of like legal cases, and like it's fully possible to facilitate these conversations and to prevent these kind of violent offenses before it happens. But yeah, I don't have all of the answers to that question. Like, the best thing, I mean, I know what I want to see, and it takes, I think, one of my friends said something about this recently, and it really kind of helped things click for me. Abolition takes a lot of imagination, and that is not to say that it's some abstract ideology. You have to be able to think way outside the box of what we currently think is possible, and then work from there. Like, think about what the ideal is. It is just no prisons and being able to resolve all issues of harm through accountability processes, and then work from there and think about, you know, what is realistic with the current system we have and how we transition away from that system. But I absolutely think we are so far behind. This country is a mess. And so we have to, by giving people human rights, and then we can start to move towards large scale abolition. Like, right now, I just think, you know, we can't even have a good view of like what the situation in this country is, because we just lock people away for being low income or for being Black, you know, or for stealing food for their families. Like, I think, you know, this conversation, like abolition, is a process, and we just have to like keep thinking of solutions and keep moving towards those solutions within our own community, and keep, you know, there's certainly, I hate counting electoralism, but there's, you know, a certain measure of like, yeah, we need Medicare for all, and we need green jobs, and we need a $15 minimum wage at the minimum. So yeah, I know I kind of like rambled on about that, but like that's kind of like what I can give you for now, just like where I'm at in my learning.
So can you draw the distinction between transformative justice and like retributive justice? Or I know that there are different, by the end of the question, you kind of like help describe the.
Yes. Yeah. So, um, restorative justice seeks to repair a harm. Transformative justice seeks to transform the individual, and ultimately transform the system. So I think the difference is transformative justice is looking at past, present, and future. And restorative justice is focusing on individual situations, what happened, and how can we fix it in this moment. So I always use restorative justice, and I've recently been thinking more along the lines of transformative justice because I think we need to be thinking in a bigger picture. Both are excellent strategies. I'm just choosing to use this language because, at least like from my perspective, I see it as more of like an overarching tool for social change, if that makes sense. Excellent. Yes, there's definitely like, I think learning the language of abolition is like, it's new because it's putting new vocabulary in. I've heard a lot of people like say, I think these are just like, we're using big words and we're putting too much power in words. I'm like, no, like they can't become buzzwords. Like there has to be power in these words. They have to resonate with people and, give people the impression of like great change and great action behind them. Like, every action has its equal opposite reaction. Like every word should also have that kind of impact. And so I think, yeah, like these words need to have action behind them. And so like we have to, there's power in the word transformative justice. Like we're doing something, we're transforming people, we're healing people, we're holding people accountable in ways that our system never could. Yeah, that's just my soapbox. Once in a while it kind of comes out, hop on it. I love talking about this stuff. If you couldn't tell, it just excites me. It's it's both old and new. It's just like the ability to learn and to kind of like think beyond what we've been given. Any more thoughts, folks?
Yeah, I was thinking about how we're in the like transformative process. Your goal is to like respect the survivor's wishes and mediate one-on-one in like a dispute between two individuals. But there's also this like recognition that we do have this like cop in our head, and we do are conditioned very much to like want this, like this idea of justice is like a punitive measure. So like how do we kind of like situate that and like very much still respect the survivor's wishes while still not like continuing to perpetuate violence because that's what like we perceive as being just.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. Okay. Yeah. So I think it took me until I started writing the transformative justice framework to really understand how carceral my own thoughts were and how much I was really like believed that like, we can't survive without these systems. Like it's important to ask these questions about like what will we do without like what will we do without prisons. Like it's important to ask those questions, but at the same time, like why are we so convinced that we need them? So yeah, I think the process of figuring out how to change your way of thinking, it's like kind of like rewiring yourself to think about these things in different ways. So in terms of transformative justice and listening to survivors and figuring out what survivors need, think about the words accountability and punishment. Like what is the difference? See you, Shreya. No worries. Have a good rest of your day. What is the difference between accountability and punishment? Like just like think about that for you. I'm gonna put you guys on the spot a little bit. Type the first word in the chat when you think of the word punishment. Hitting, pain, consequence, harm. Yeah, yes, I love this one. Restricting and taking away. Restricting and taking away. Yeah, totally. Okay, so what's the first word or phrase, words you think of when you hear the word accountability? Also, chancla, I love that. Ownership, responsibility, responsibility for actions, responsibility, yes. So that's where it's at. Acknowledgement, yeah, totally. So when I don't want to, like, I'm not going to use anything graphic because I don't want anyone to feel pressured or triggered in this conversation. But when someone has been harmed, you know, I guess we can go back to using a public school analogy. A 6-year-old throws a pencil at another 6-year-old. So let's take those two 6-year-olds out of the room. Let's first ask the 6-year-old who got hit with the pencil how they're feeling. And, you know, let's then ask the 6-year-old who threw the pencil why they threw a pencil at their friend. And so then let's ask the other 6-year-old, you know, what can your friend do to make it better that they threw a pencil at you? And that might be, you know, saying sorry. That might be admitting that they were angry about something and didn't use their words. That might be switching seats so that they feel a little safer since that they were hurt and they don't necessarily want to be cleaned right now. We just, you know, it's just important. We always ask the survivor what they need first, and then make it, you know, healing for the survivor, and then making it a learning experience. So yeah, that's kind of, and of course, like, you know, there's going to be situations that are much bigger than 6-year-olds throwing pencils at each other's, but we should be kind of keeping that same sort of mindset close to us when we're having, you know, more serious conversations. Like, it's just when you throw a person in jail because they hurt another person, did the person who was hurt ask you to throw that person in jail? Maybe they did. In some cases, maybe they want their perpetrator locked up. But were they really ever asked, or did they file a police report and then were forced into a series of interviews where they had to recount in detail, and then they're forced up on a stand in a courtroom? That's not what everyone wants. So we just have to be thinking outside the box of what we can be doing in order to repair these harms. Does that all make sense? I know it's not, like, I sort of ramble, I feel like, because I think a lot and I talk a lot. And have exact answers, but like that's, you know, just kind of what I'm thinking. It's just like, think about accountability versus punishment. If you take the kid's pencil away so that they can't do their schoolwork, or you send them into timeout, are they really learning anything, or are they just learning that they're just going to be hurt when they're upset about something? Like, why did that kid throw a pencil? There's probably something going on. It doesn't mean it's okay. They have to take responsibility, and they have to not do that again because they could have really hurt their friend. But it doesn't mean to just be put in timeout. Like, they, you know, if their friend, you know, the kid who threw the pen should take the steps to make their friend feel better and make their friend feel safe. Is kind of Yeah.
I guess something I'd like to comment, kind of picking back off the school example. Say a lot of things like just for like in terms of conformity, it's like, hey, if you don't do this, sit in line or if you speak out of turn. A lot of those types of, I would say, like I guess in the real world you're not necessarily punished for them in the same ways. But and the excuse when they give punishments for those to enforce those is, hey, this is not going to work. And if you're in elementary, they'll be like, this is not going to work in junior high. And junior high, like, you're not going to get away with this in high school. And like in high school, they're like, you're not going to get away with this in college. And in college, no one cares. So it's like a lot of it's like, why did that matter in the first place?
And that is totally fits within like the definition of carceralism I've been using. Like, why are we so set in that some things are wrong? Like, some are terrible, like, but like, why are we so set in that people have to behave a certain way, and that when people do something wrong, they have to be dealt with in the same way? Like it just kind of goes back to the comment I made about everything being binary to us. And like, yeah, I love that. I actually love that you brought that up, because like, yeah, everyone in high school, I remember one time my friend and I's like homework assignments looked kind of similar. It's not because we cheated. It's literally just because we were both leftists. And so we both had the same opinion on like a Walt Whitman poem. And like my professor was like, that's not gonna fly in college. You come up with the same opinion and you're gonna get, expelled for scholastic dishonesty. And in college, like, yes, you can't commit scholastic dishonesty. You will be like disciplined, but sharing your opinions and having the same opinions as someone is not gonna get you in trouble. Professors don't give a shit what you say. It's just that we've been taught to believe, and teachers have been taught to believe, that they have to make us believe that these things are right or wrong. I feel like I like using the public school example because I actually think academia, school teachers are actually some of the most carceral areas of our culture, because they are so specific. They're all the same. One of my friends is getting a teaching shit, and the teacher was just like telling us like bad apple in the class and how they should focus on the 30 good apples and just the bad apple behind, and that 6-year-old a bad apple. Figure out wrong and figure out how to help the 6-year-old. They can contribute to class. It's just, we don't need the system of telling they're doing something wrong. We don't need any of these systems. And that's just, we're cautious. It's just that it's the same concepts of like what right and wrong, crime and punishment, that are being replicated at all these different tiers of our society.
First, hi, I'm Izzy. I'd like to say that everything that's been talked about has been like super intriguing. You've opened up my mind in a lot of ways to things I hadn't thought of before. But going along with the example, I have a question for you about, kind of with your framework, what would happen if the pencil was thrown and the survivor was asked what they needed, and then, everything was addressed, and then it happened again. Like what happens if there isn't any change in what the perpetrator keeps doing after the fact?
Yeah. Have a conversation with the kid who was harmed. And say like, this happened again. How are you feeling? What do you need? And then, gonna have to have a serious conversation with the other kid and say like, we had this conversation. You came to an agreement with your friend that you hurt. And now you've done it again. And they are 6, and so you have to be able to have this conversation in their terms, but at 6 years old, they should be able to understand that they can't hurt their friend. And so I'd say probably if I was a teacher teaching from a transformative justice perspective, probably I would say I was, going to move the kid across the room. And then I would, probably say we're going to have another conversation, pull them aside privately. I would probably consider what was going on at home, if we're talking about kids. And I think at that point, you can say, we're gonna have to do something else. Like if you can't stop throwing the pencil at your friend. And not, I don't want it to be like not as a threat, but like as just a serious conversation of you've done something seriously harmful, and you're going to have to face consequences for that. And so we might, have another discussion about what they can do to fix it with their friend. But I think, in that case, it's, having another, it's probably like separating the kids and then having another conversation. And, ultimately, if a kid is continuing to do it over and over and over, then, conversation with leadership at your school and with parents to, figure out how you can help this kid. I think a lot of the time, when someone repeats an offense, you have slightly more, I guess, concrete measures to make sure that their behavior is changed and or that other people are safe. But I would just want to be cautious because, if we're sticking to the, like, and we're not even using the example of 6 year, like I actually do teach kids, and like if we're truly using the example of 6-year-olds not just as an analogy, like you need to figure out how they're being punished at home, because if they're being punished with timeouts or physical punishment at home, conversations are going to have a different effect on them than they will with a kid whose parent maybe, has a conversation with them. And so I think that's like kind of another aspect of like this, and I know I'm like rambling again, but is just we have to be thinking about how if a violent system is replicated in one space and then we're using a new system in another space, we're gonna have to kind of like find the in the middle, like to figure out how to make the new system work, given that people are used to the old system. And so, in a school setting with a 6-year-old who's hurt the same kid in the same way twice, that really might be kind of removing them from the classroom setting for a period, to figure out how to make things work for them and also to make sure your other kids are protected. But yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert teacher, but like that's kind of like that's the thought process I would go through if I was dealing with the situation. Does that all kind of make sense? Does it leave more questions open? I feel like these, like when I'm thinking about justice, like when I'm doing readings, I always like end up answering questions with more questions.
In your example, how is removing the student from the classroom different than like detention or like out of school suspension?
I think it depends in the way you do it. So like when I say, remove them, I would probably, ask someone else to come in and, finish teaching the lesson with the rest of my kids, or ask someone outside the classroom to kind of sit with them and work on their work with them, until, I have capacity to facilitate another conversation with them. Like, you know, in the moment you can do a conversation between them and another kid, but if they're continuing to hurt the kid, there has to be a degree of separation. I don't think that has to mean detention. I don't think separating a kid from the rest of the class has to mean you're punishing them. I think you know, but also be protecting the rest of your kids. And that could be also like having them kind of just like sit slightly away from the other kids, you know, in the back of the class, not, or at the front of the class, not so they feel like isolated or that they're being punished, but so that you're protecting your other kids and also understand that they did do something and they're going to have to face the consequences of that, even if the consequences aren't a punishment. So I think the way you choose to separate them actually does make it different than just putting them in detention. Like, I think separation, removing them from a classroom doesn't have to be deprivation. You don't have to be depriving them of their education or of the things that they're enjoying in school just because you're separating them and keeping the kid they hurt safe, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think, like, in the case of, like, I don't think you have to make a 6-year-old feel bad because they hurt someone else. You have to make them understand that they hurt someone else and that they have to take the steps to make that better. But, like, you don't have to make them feel isolated. You don't have to make them feel like a criminal. I just feel like telling a kid they're in timeout, telling a kid they're going to detention, taking away things like, you know, markers and, you know, crayons, taking away their worksheets, taking away their iPad, whatever they have, like it's just going to make them more angry and they're probably just going to keep taking it on the other kid. So just separate them in a way that keeps the other kids safe, but not in a way that makes them feel like they're being punished. And, you know, I mean, truly, there's some kids that are continuing to do the same thing again and again and again. And like, I'm not a child care expert. I've done some teaching and stuff, but like, you know, then there has to be a conversation with parents and school administrators to figure out like truly what's going on with this kid. But again, like, I don't think separating a kid has to mean punishment or detention. That was sort of a long answer to what should have been a simple. Any other thoughts on this? I know it's like a lot to take in, and I personally always think of questions like after the fact or at 3 a.m.
I think it's interesting, like, and especially with this example, it made me realize like how far back the idea of these systems goes, at least for me, because I just had flashbacks to like, you know, during nap time, like I would never sleep and my parents would never put me in timeout, but at school I would be put in timeout and I wouldn't sleep. And then all my friends would go to recess and I would just be stuck and I wasn't going to do what they wanted me to do because it wasn't like, you know, I'm not going to say like it wasn't the right or wrong way to go about it. It just didn't help me understand why I was doing something the wrong way. Like, just because that's how it worked, like, timeout didn't work.
No, exactly. It's just this idea that all people can fit within the same system. I also like, no, this was actually like, that was great that you brought that up because I also wasn't a napper. And there was a point where my mom just said like, you cannot make my kid nap. You can make my kid be quiet so she doesn't wake up the other kids, but like, don't punish her because she's not going to sleep at 4 years old. Like, it's truly teaching children that normal behavior is wrong is going to make it really hard to teach them how harmful behaviors are actually wrong because they've been forced to believe that things that are completely normal for them are wrong. Like, it totally messes up our sense of the world. When, you know, not napping, that's fine. You don't want to sleep? Great. You're a kid. Like, I mean, you know, I'm sure your mom would love if you would take a nap, but like, if you're not, don't be punished for that. Because then when you push another kid because you're overtired or because you didn't get to play at recess, that's on the teacher. for teaching you that you were going to be punished for normal behavior. And now you're probably going to be punished for that actually harmful behavior, and you're not going to know the difference anymore. So yeah, it's everywhere.